We go marching, marching in the beauty of the day. A million darkened kitchens, a thousand mill lofts gray, are touched with all the radiance that a sudden sun discloses. For the people hear us singing, bread and roses, bread and roses. As we go marching, marching, we battle too for men, for they are women's children, and we mother them again. Our life shall not be sweated from birth until life closes. Heart starve as well as bodies, give us bread, but give us roses. As we go marching, marching, unnumbered women dead go crying through our singing their ancient call for bread, small and love and beauty, their drudging spirits new. Yes, it is bread we fight for, but we fight for roses too. As we go marching, marching, we bring the braver day. The rising of the women means the rising of the race. No more the grudge and either than that toil where one reposes, but a sharing of life's glory, bread and roses, bread and roses. My life shall not be sweated from birth until life closes. Heart soul as well as body, bread and roses, bread and roses.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen in OPN. Welcome to tonight's show. Would like to get just a quick AV check and make sure that you can hear us. Professor Robert Forrant from the University of Massachusetts is with us tonight, and we are going to be discussing the Great Lawrence Strike of 1912. So if somebody from the chat stream can let us know if you can hear us clearly. Good evening, Mr. Forrant. Thank you for coming.
Bob Works, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Bob Works, and it's a pleasure to be here. Okay, so I'm going to start our little image loop that we talked about, and then we'll launch right into the discussion, and hopefully all this stuff will work. So just to lay out the scene for the people that are viewing, what you have on the right-hand side of your screen is going to be an image loop that was taken from Professor Forrant's class Facebook websites. Our dear friend clearly helped put this together, and we looped it, and so I thought we'd just leave it run to the side because the images are so compelling, and they're just beautiful, beautiful photographic archive of what happened. So we'll do that. So Professor Forrant, why don't you introduce yourself better than I did, and then we'll launch into the interview.
I teach labor history, immigration history, and a variety of other U.S. history subjects at UMass Lowell. I've been teaching at UMass Lowell for about 20 years. Before that, for 15 years, I was a machinist and a business agent for the International Union of Electrical Workers, Local 206 in Springfield, Massachusetts. The factory I worked in closed, and after a few years of kicking around, I went back to school and now have the best job I think anybody on the planet could have, being a teacher and having the space to be able to work on these kinds of projects, which for a labor historian, what could be better than working on the centennial of probably one of the most famous strikes in American labor history.
And I have to say, as we were talking before we went on the air, you do such a wonderful job. The Centennial Project is such a beautifully rendered job. And I did, this is new information to me already. Your background as a union guy, and so you're able to see not only from the perspective of the academic, but you've lived the life. So you bring a lot to the table. So that's outstanding. And how lucky your students must be. I think that I'm a little bit envious of them.
I'm not sure they feel that way sometimes, but you'll have to, next time you can have a couple of them on and see what they think.
Okay. Why don't you tell us what exactly was the Great Lawrence Strike of 1912?
I'll give you the shorthand, and then we can sort of delve into it more in detail, because when you ask me that after all the work that I've been doing, and students and other people in Lawrence, that's a lead-in for about 5 hours of a monologue, and I don't want to do that. I mean, the essence in short was the strike in Lawrence in 1912, which started the first week of the middle of January, January 11, January 12 was when the walkout began, was one of the first times that the textile industry, which was a dominant industry in the United States at that point in the early 20th century, was the first time that workers, largely immigrant workers, confronted capital in such an organized way, held out for almost 11 weeks in one of the coldest and most brutal of New England winters imaginable, and were able to defeat the entrenched power of the American Woolen Company and several other mills, which were, again, some of the most profitable and powerful in the United States. When we think about the U.S. economy, we think of steel mills and coal mines and railroads, but the textile industry was huge and powerful, and it was able to marshal the police, the state militia, and a whole bunch of other forces against the strikers. And again, 40 nationalities, that many languages, the majority of workers in the mills were women. All of it defied the conventional wisdom that nationalities couldn't organize across their languages and cultures, and especially it put to rest the myth that women would not organize and wouldn't fight for better circumstances for themselves and their kids.
And one of the things that really drew us to this show and this conversation was the participation and the emergence of a significant women's movement, especially at that time. So I do want to get into that a little bit more. The strike is also commonly referred to as the Bread and Roses strike. What was the origin of that terminology?
Actually, the term has a sort of convoluted history. No workers in Lawrence at the time of the strike ever called it the Bread and Roses strike. People have sort of grafted it on over time. The origin really is a poem that was written by a poet named Oppenheim, who wrote a poem in 1911, before the strike even happened, called Bread and Roses. Some people think it was a poem actually about a strike that he had witnessed in Chicago, Illinois in 1911. So it was published, and it appeared in a magazine well in advance of the Lawrence strike. After the fact, he claimed he wrote it about the Lawrence strike. This was in 1913, and the poem was resurrected and became a very popular poem. And I guess he probably, made some money or something. I don't know. But and so in the late 60s, early 70s, Judy Collins, whose song you played as the lead-in, and other people, particularly related to the emergence of the women's movement in the late 60s, early 70s, the women's movement really took the strike to heart as they were sort of researching women's past history and what had been left out of the history books. And so several, Mimi Farina and other folk singers, put it to music, sang different versions of the song, and then the strike really became known as the Bread and Roses strike. I usually call it the Great Lawrence Textile Strike of 1912 because that's more like what the people in it called it. But it's real easy shorthand now. When you say Bread and Roses strike, most people that are familiar with labor history will know what you're talking about.
Well, one things we work on here on this channel is really clear definitions of terms and titles and all that. So that was great because that was kind of like the reverse media spin of the time, I guess, because we had the strike took place. It was known by the people participating as one thing, and throughout history it's become learned another thing. So there's an object lesson there, but whatever the entry point to get us there is great.
Yeah, whatever.
And I did want to mention that was a Judy Collins recording, and the words in the song were actually from the poem. Is that accurate? I wanted to make sure.
That's accurate.
Yeah.
That's accurate, yes.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about what the city of Lawrence was like at the time of the strike, like the population, the demographic, lay out the landscape in which the strike took place for us?
Lawrence was, like a lot of other mill cities in New England, laid out as a planned industrial city. There was nothing there in the early 1840s. Some wealthy investors came in, dammed up the river to create canals and water power to run the mills, and laid out a textile city. Lawrence was primarily woolen mills, some cotton and some others. There were shoes being made there and a couple other things, but the dominant employer was wool mills. There were about 80,000 people in Lawrence in the 1910 census. About 70% of that population were either immigrants or the children of immigrant parents. So it was largely an immigrant city. About 40 nationalities, the largest French-Canadian, Italian, Franco-Belgian, Irish. I think if I didn't mention Irish immigrants had sort of been the first ones in the city in the 1840s. 1850s, sort of leaving Ireland from the potato famine that happened there. And so Irish laborers sort of physically built the city, dug the canals, built the first mills. After the Civil War and the early 1870s, large migration down from Canada, French-speaking largely walked down from Quebec through Maine, New Hampshire, then into Lawrence. So on the eve of the strike, it was, just this incredible, almost like the UN of cities. It was every language imaginable. They were fairly well pronounced immigrant neighborhoods. Like you could look on a map and figure out there was a Polish neighborhood, an Italian neighborhood, a Franco-Belgian neighborhood, and yet at the edges of those neighborhoods, lots of people lived on the same street and in the same building together, which really becomes important for what happened in the strike. I'm sure we'll get to that at some point. So, sort of like you would think of New York City or whatever, an Italian area, or Boston, the north end of Boston, largely Italian or whatever. So that was pretty much the structure of the city. The mills were sort of built around the middle of the city. Lawrence was small. It was only about 6.5 square miles. So it was mills, working class housing, and churches, and not a heck of a lot else. If you began to be successful economically in Lawrence, you moved out of the city. So Lawrence really didn't have a middle class. It had a laboring class, a working class, some skilled workers, but largely a working class city, gigantic, huge mill buildings, some of the largest that were ever built in the United States. The mill owners, the overseers, all lived in surrounding cities and towns, not in Lawrence proper. So it was workers and mills.
Right. Absentee owners.
Absolutely, absentee ownership.
Yep. And so roughly how many textile mills were in the city at the time?
Probably these were large complexes, so there were about 15 really large complexes, but each complex usually had 4 or 5 buildings connected with it. So there were, and so of the 80 to 85,000 people living in the city, around 40 to 45,000 people made their living directly in the mills or off of the mills.
Right.
And then everybody else obviously were young kids and whatever.
Right.
So again, canals, gigantic mill buildings, and tenements that workers lived in.
Yeah, 50% of the population directly depended on the mills. I'm obviously from the South, and I grew up at the end of the textile boom in the South, so I know the scope and scale of these complexes. Could you maybe just quickly describe just generally what one of those complexes are like, so we can know what the workers were faced with?
Usually, most of the mills in Lawrence were six-story brick structures, very dense, sturdy buildings, but on the inside, packed with machinery. Every square inch of floor space that could fit a machine had a machine on it. Space was money. People now say time was money. Back then, space and time, but space was money. The more you could cram machinery onto a shop floor, the more wool, the more cloth you could produce, the more money you could make. So these places were incredibly loud. They were really health hazards. The air would be full of fibers and dust, depending on the occupation that you were involved in. If you were combing out the wool, or you were doing some, certain kinds of jobs, it was really dangerous. Accidents were a common occurrence. One of the things I've done is read accident reports, which seems like a weird thing to want to read, but rather than actually, I guess, work on ending injuries, they actually kept a really good log of the injuries. So you can read the daily reports. It looks like a war. This person, had some machinery fall on top of them, or that person had their hair caught in a machine, or this person lost their finger, or the elevator doors opened and there was no elevator there, and they fell in the elevator shaft and died. I mean, this was just a routine occurrence. And so, if you were one of the really startling statistics, if you were a mill worker in Lawrence and you started working in the mill, for every 100 people that started working in the mill at, say, age 16, fully 1/3 of them would not make it into their mid-30s. They would die before they reached their early 30s. That's how dangerous and hazardous the work was.
And was it typical in the mills? The southern mills all had like high transom windows that were very often closed, or if they were open for ventilation, just to a certain degree, but very often blacked out, so the workers didn't have a lot of natural light and didn't know what time of day it was.
I've not read about the windows being covered over in the Lawrence mills. That might be. I've not run across that, but they were nailed shut. They weren't open because you had to keep a certain humidity and such in the building as you were making cloth, so that the threads didn't break and whatever. And so you didn't want the windows to be open. So that definitely was the case.
So overall, a brutal working environment that would be hard for us to imagine these days, I suspect. Approximately how many strikers were involved in the strike, and was it specific to one mill, or did the strike go across mills?
The strike started in the Everett Mill building, which, for whatever quirk of the pay cycle, workers in the Everett Mill were paid first on January 11th, the morning of January 11th. A large number of workers in the Everett Mill happened to be Polish. What happened was in 1910, the Massachusetts legislature passed a law reducing the work week, the legal work week for women and kids, from 56 to 54 hours. This was considered a progressive reform back then. Workers were concerned because they were paid so poorly as it was, whether in fact mill owners would now cut their pay by those 2 hours. And they had been trying to meet for weeks and weeks before the start of 1912 with the mill owners to find out what their intentions were. And the mill owners refused to meet with them. So the workers pretty much deduced correctly that the mill owners were going to cut their pay. Otherwise, why not meet with them and tell them they weren't going to cut their pay? So this is not a spontaneous strike per se. Workers have been organizing for months across the city, sort of on a what-if scenario. What do we do if they cut our wages? What do we do if they cut our wages? And so the Industrial Workers of the World, the union that's done a lot of organizing in Lawrence, is there. There are about 20 nationality groupings of the IWW across the city. There's a meeting held on January 10th, the evening of January 10th, to sort of say, if our wages are cut, we'll walk out. Polish workers, mostly women, in the Everett mill realize their pay's cut short. I can't say it in Polish, but they walk out of the mills yelling, short pay, all out. They walk out of the Everett and they walk around the other mills because they're all contained in a really geographical area that's easy to walk to in Lawrence, and they yell into the windows for everybody else to let them know. There's a gigantic meeting that evening, the evening of January 11th, and on January 12th, when the rest of the mills get paid, everybody else walks out as well. So fairly quickly, there's between 15 and 20,000 workers out in the streets of the city. And so this is Thursday and Friday, January 11, January 12. The mill owners fully expect that on Monday everybody will go back to work. On Monday, even more people refuse to go to work. And so by the middle of the day on Monday, there's between 25 and 28,000 workers who are now out on strike, and people who are not actively on strike are not going to be able to get into the mills because the workers are blocking the bridges over the canals and sort of massed in other places in the city to make it very uncomfortable if anybody thinks they're going to go to work.
Okay, so we had a population of 80,000, 40,000 that worked in the mills, and within the course of a weekend, we have 25,000 plus out on strike. So that's a substantial statement. What was the demographic of the strikers? I know we touched it was a multinational kind of town. So what was the demographic, ages, nationalities, genders, kind of give us a picture of the strikers.
The demographic was everybody, and that's why the strike worked. The understanding in the city prior to the walkout itself was this is only going to work if we're united. We can't have it be that Polish workers and Lithuanian workers and Italian workers go to work and French Canadian workers and Irish workers and Armenian workers are on strike. The strike's going to fall apart. So a great deal of effort is put into creating a really large, broad-based strike committee, almost like Noah's Ark, like 2 of every immigrant group in the city. This is a 50-person committee that's representative of the groups in the city. The commitment is also made in the run-up to the strike that all the major meetings where any decisions are made will be translated into every single language of whoever is in the room so that everybody can understand everything that's going on. You have to understand the profundity, if that's a word, the profoundness, profundity, whatever. Anyway, the big deal here is that a lot of the meetings are outdoors in the middle of the winter in Lawrence, on the Lawrence Common. They take a long time because everything is being translated. But the commitment is made to make that happen, again, to create the unity that everybody knew would be necessary to take on the mill owners.
And we're talking translating into a dozen or more different languages.
Yep, yeah.
And
we have the human microphone long before Occupy with its human microphone. We have literally the human microphone. It worked incredibly. So if somebody was speaking in Italian, let's say, from the bandstand where on the Common, somebody else in the crowd who understood Italian and French would have all the workers clustered around him or her that needed it translated into French, would be translating the Italian into French for that group of people. Over someplace else would be somebody doing that in Polish. Over someplace else would be somebody doing that in Yiddish or whatever, or Lithuanian or whatever it would be. And so you would have like this, literal like voice, this massive like, voices everywhere with people translating and then voting collectively on decisions once everybody knew what they were voting on.
That's just fantastic. It's just a wonderful. I just can picture it in my mind, and how hard it must have been environmentally to do that outside. But how all these people came together and they found a way to communicate and bridge their communication things so everybody could be on the same page. I think that's a lesson we could learn from them. You touched on it briefly. I want to get into it a little bit. What was the role the Wobblies played leading up to, during the strike, and after? Because you said there was some pre-organization or some pre-planning going on as for contingency purposes, and it seems like the Wobblies had a fairly big hand in that and brought their organizational skills to bear. Can you give us some input on that?
Yeah, the Industrial Workers of the World was present in Lawrence, you know, a couple, 2-3 years earlier than the actual 1912 strike. They had been, you know, people living in Lawrence. Lawrence workers had formed a IWW local in the mills, and at the same time had formed foreign language. I'm looking around for the paper. Yeah, here it is. Foreign language locals, branches of the local union IWW Local 20. So in 1910, in the city directory, I have it right here in front of me. There was an English language branch, a French branch, Italian, Polish, German, Lithuanian, Armenian, Jewish, Syrian, Greek, Russian, Portuguese, Lettish, Flemish, Turkish. Every one of those groupings in the city had a branch connected to the local union number 20 of the Industrial Workers of the World. So they were there and they were organizing, again, in advance of the strike. When I was in graduate school and studying the strike, it was always taught as like, we should like look at this as a miracle because it was like the virgin birth. It was just this incredibly spontaneous thing that happened, and wow, what a great thing it was. And the more I thought about it and the more my own background, I said, well, it just doesn't ring true to me. Something else had to be going on. And by being in Lawrence the last 2 years and finding all this stuff, it's perfectly clear. So all that prep work is done. Once the strike starts, the IWW folks in Lawrence, again, indigenous workers to the city of Lawrence that have formed all of these branches, call the headquarters in New York City. And New York City sends up two guys, Joe Eder and Arturo Giovannitti, who speak multiple languages, and they come up on the train from New York City right away that weekend to provide their expertise and some coherence to the leadership. But there's a strike negotiating committee of 10 Lawrence workers who are going to meet with the mill owners, and there's this large 50-person committee. The IWW organizers who come in from the outside provide a lot of the organization, the structure of the organization, but they're not, they don't try to horn in and make it their strike. This is really a Lawrence strike, and I think that's, again, partly explanation for why this worked. Meanwhile, the American Federation of Labor is actually trying to convince workers that it's organized in Lawrence not to honor the picket lines and to go to work. The American Federation of Labor has organized English language speaking workers, mostly the most highly skilled workers in the mills. They've never made an effort to try to organize the large numbers of industrial workers, laborers, immigrant workers in the city of Lawrence at all, and they try. It doesn't work. By the third day of the strike, early that next week, the English language speaking workers have their own big meeting and vote to go out on strike too and join the strike. That's the point when the mill owners know they're screwed.
I find it interesting that the AFL was trying to organize counter or separate. What was the thinking behind that? Was that just like a relative class kind of struggle there, or I mean, it just seems I hadn't heard that. So why would the AFL try to organize separately and divisively? It seems like
that had been that's their MO. That's who they were. I mean, back in the 1880s, late 1880s, when they get started, they're very much, we organize skilled workers, we organize men, we organize the trades, we don't organize the other people over there. So while the country's building these mills and having, you know, 1 million or so immigrants a year coming in the last decade of the 19th, first decade of the 20th centuries, they're totally out of step with what's happening in the workforce. They do a good job organizing narrowly with the workers that they organize, and they try to control access to particular trades to keep wages high for those workers, but they're not helpful in a lot of these kind of strikes, not just in Lawrence. This is pretty much the way they operate elsewhere. I mean, when the bread and roses strike is over, they try to take credit for it, as though they organized it. They claim it as a great success for the AFL. Of course, anybody that was there and knows that was a bunch of malarkey, but they try.
So, as it has been, so it still goes. It seems like, you know, the same sorts.
Yeah.
So this is why we need to know our history, people.
That's why I'm a history teacher.
So we're through the first weekend. We're on the Monday morning. Can you step us through the chronology of the rest of the strike? How long did it last? You know, how it unfolded?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that weekend, obviously people meet, they get together. Picket lines are really solid on Monday morning, at which point the mayor of the city contacts the governor of Massachusetts to have the governor send in the militia. And the militia arrives quickly in Lawrence to protect the mills, and essentially martial law is declared on the streets of Lawrence. It becomes illegal for any group of 3 or more people to stand still and talk. And so this is to prevent, they think, workers congregating at the canalways to try to keep workers out. If workers are standing still, they can be rousted by the militia with very large bayonets on the end of their rifles. There's several major sort of clashes between strikers and the militia the first week. But the picket lines hold strong. One of the fascinating things is a lot of strike tactics are now going to take on the hue of what happened in European strikes. So something that hadn't happened that much in the U.S. before, gigantic moving picket lines. So within the first few days, because workers realize they're going to be rousted if they try to stand still, they form these gigantic moving picket lines of 5, 6, 7, 8,000 workers who assemble early in the morning and just starts marching and singing in front of all the mill buildings, and they defy the militia to do anything because there are just so many workers out in the street. They have all the different immigrant groups in the city have their own social clubs. All those social clubs have bands, marching bands, and so marching bands from Lithuanian, Syrian, Lebanese, Polish social clubs are leading the workers marching, singing through the streets of Lawrence. Everybody learns everybody else's songs in different languages. Sometimes the strike is referred to because of this as the singing strike. Some of the journalists remark when they're writing in the newspapers that it looks like the workers are having a really good time. Early on, the mill owners try to break the strike by actually doing something pretty amazing. William Wood, who is the head of the American Woolen Company, the largest mill conglomeration in New England, actually pays people to plant dynamite in 3 known strikers' meeting places. And then the people that for William Wood plant the dynamite call the police and say they've overheard that strikers are going to use dynamite and try to blow up the mills. And they tell the police where the dynamite is that they've planted. The police go to these 3 known places, find the dynamite, arrest the workers inside these 3 places, a cobbler shop, a barber shop, and a hall, and a union meeting hall. But the plot unravels fairly quickly. The people that plant the dynamite are not too bright. One of the guys who plants the dynamite is the funeral director in the city, and he wraps the dynamite in a newspaper that's like a national newspaper for funeral directors, and he leaves his name, the mailing label, he leaves it on the newspaper. And so the police look at the dynamite, look at the newspaper it's wrapped in, put 2 and 2 together, let the people they've arrested out of jail, and arrest this character. Eventually he goes on trial and he spills the beans that he was hired by William Wood the head of American Woolen Company. Of course, because wood is rich, nothing happens to wood. So that falls apart. Then there's a major confrontation on the morning of January 29th, right near the Everett Mill on the corner of Garden and Union Streets, and a young woman striker by the name of Anna Lapizzo is shot by the militia and dies right on the street. And the police and the militia use that as a pretext to arrest two of the IWW folks who have come up from New York City, Joe Eder and Arturo Giovannitti, and they arrest the third guy, Joe Caruso, who's a Lawrence IWW member, and they charge them with conspiracy before the fact. Conspiracy before the fact in the death of Anna Lapizzo, and the charge is that if they hadn't been there and the strike hadn't been happening, she wouldn't have been dead. So they're arrested in a blatant attempt to try to break the strike. They end up in jail for 10 months. They go on trial for their lives in October, November, like right around now, 100 years ago. And so that's a big to-do. A few days later, a second striker is stabbed in the back by a militiaman's bayonet, a young guy named John Ramey. He dies. And so the strike sort of settles into a very kind of uneasy peace, with the militia riding through the streets on horseback with large bayonets on the end of rifles. And it's a pretty scary place if you're a striker. This goes on until the middle of February, and then something very significant happens in the middle of February. Again, a tactic from Europe is employed. In European strikes a lot, when the tension builds, parents would send their kids away from the city to sympathetic families elsewhere for safekeeping. And so this tactic is now employed in Lawrence. It's the first time that we know of this, that this happened in the United States. And so trainloads of kids go to Barry, Vermont, New York City, Bridgeport, Connecticut, Philadelphia, and publicity is really in the favor of the strikers. When the kids get to these places, there are parades, there's lots of newspaper coverage, and so the militia and the mayor decide to not let any more kids leave. So on February 24th, at the train station, there's about 50 kids getting ready to get on a train to go to New York City. The militia goes to the train station, beats the crap out of the women and the kids, and prevents them physically from getting on the train, and arrests everybody and throws them in jail. The Sunday newspapers are full of the outrage of women and children being beaten up. A woman striker has a miscarriage. This generates even more publicity in favor of the strikers and against the mill owners. Congress now calls for hearings on what's happening in Lawrence, and a few days later, hearings convene in Washington, D.C. A number of strikers travel to Washington, D.C., including 10 kids, 14, 15 years old, who have been working in the mills for a year or two. They all testify. A few days after that, for the first time, William Wood and the mill owners agree to meet with the strikers and begin to reach a settlement. And a few days later, March 15th, there's a settlement reached, a strike vote taken, and the strike is over. So that's as succinct as I can be.
Oh, that was good. So, essentially, the strikers dug in, resisted all the attempts to break the strike, held out for 2 months in the winter, I might add. The most difficult time of the year to even attempt something like that, and stood strong. And so the end result were that they made some progress in their goals and returned to the workplaces. Is that accurate?
Yeah, they got the raises that they were looking for. This was a really interesting settlement. Usually when contracts are negotiated, the people that are already making the most money get the most raises. This contract was negotiated so that the lowest paid workers got the highest percentage increases. Amongst other things, no retaliation for strikers, for strike leaders. A whole host of demands were met in March, and people began to go back to work. A funny thing that happened in the strike settlement meeting, which was on the Common, Big Bill Haywood, one of the major sort of characters in the IWW and in sort of labor history lore, headed up the meeting on the Common to vote the strike settlement, and the workers vote to end the strike, and everybody's cheering. The vote happens to be on a Thursday, and Haywood goes up and yells out to everybody, "The strike is over. Everybody go back to work tomorrow," which was Friday. And from the crowd, this is from the newspaper accounts, Haywood hears all this booing, and he says, "What's going on? I thought we just voted to settle the strike and go back to work." And they start yelling. They don't want to go back to work till Monday. They want a 3-day weekend so they can party after having won the strike. And I found that really great, sort of a really cool part of the story, that even though they had been without money or whatever, they felt it important to kick back for 3 days and party and celebrate what at the time was a pretty significant victory.
Right. I want to do a little bit of a segue because I want to come back to the kids. And I just had clearly put the website address into chat stream, and I encourage everybody to spend some time on that. One of the things that I found incredible was when you say that they sent the kids away for safekeeping, it's not like they just bundled them up, put them on the train, and sent them to relatives. It was very, very organized, well documented. I saw in the research for the show, I saw the actual the notes and the documentation that accompanied the kids. And can you speak to just that part of how that was organized? It wasn't just thrown together. I mean, it was very well done. It was extremely well planned, organized, and executed.
Yeah, I mean, and actually a couple of the people that were involved in it were Helen Keller and Margaret Sanger, two sort of major figures in American history, women's history, social history. But what had happened was, as the strike progressed, the strikers received lots of support, lots of sort of solidarity from elsewhere in the country, and donations started pouring in. And it was really one of the only ways the strike could maintain itself, because workers, there were, as I tell my students, workers didn't have a debit card. There was no money, and so donations poured in. And then eventually what happened is, in New York and Philly and Barre, Vermont, and other places, families that were sympathetic to the goals of the strike came forward and volunteered to take kids into their homes for the duration of the strike, however long that would be. And so homes were checked out, people were sent to the various cities to meet with people to sort of organize the whole deal. The commitment was made that the kids would be in school while they were in wherever they were. So if they went to Barre, Vermont, they would be put in school for however long they were there, or in New York City or Philadelphia or whatever it would be. Each kid wore, sort of like way back in the day when you would fly, if you were a kid, you would have a thing on your coat saying who was going to meet you at the airport or whatever. Well, they had that card way back then in 1912. Then your name, your parents' names, your address, everything, and like who you were going to go live with when you got to New York City or Baltimore or Philly or Barre, Vermont, or whatever it was. And like chaperones would come up from New York or Philly or wherever to be on the train to go back to wherever. And as well, several parent chaperones from Lawrence would go on the train with the kids to the place to make sure everybody got situated. The mill owners tried at the start, when this was really going well, they essentially charged that the kids were kidnapped. And they actually brought some parents to court saying that they had abandoned their children and this was child abuse. And that was ostensibly part of the reason that they used to try to block these kids from going to Philadelphia, that this was child abuse and kidnapping. Meanwhile, clearly it wasn't. But that was when they went to Congress and testified about all of this. That was one of the reasons they gave for why they broke up people leaving the train station. So yeah, this was really, and again, it was a tactic not employed before, certainly not to the scale it was employed in Lawrence, in Europe. And so it was, again, something that lots of workers were ready for. The other thing that tactically worked really well was there was a very large Franco-Belgian population in Lawrence at the time of the strike, Franco-Belgian immigrant workers. And there's a tradition in that population in Europe to have food co-ops. And so there was a very large Franco-Belgian food co-op in Lawrence at the time of the strike. It became the main sort of soup kitchen feeding station for the strikers. The Franco-Belgians had great communication with all the area farmers, were able to get lots of food donated, and essentially became the backbone of sort of the logistics of the strike. Doctors volunteered to come in to do health checks of kids, of workers, whatever, if need be. So whenever the soup kitchens were set up, doctors and nurses would volunteer their time to be there too. So this was a very rich sort of community of workers that did this.
Yep. Well, you know, that's a good segue right now to talk about the mutual aid aspect of this and the relief organizations that were assisting the strikers. And it's sort of ironic, you know, with the Sandy storm in New York, and we're seeing how important that is up there. And in 1912, during this strike event, there was a huge network of local support, feeding people, housing people. So can you speak a little bit more about the mutual aid kind of situations, and were there any specific societies organized, or was it just a community coming together and doing this, and how did all that transpire?
I mean, in large measure, it was the community coming together. But again, sort of prior to the strike, the various immigrant groups in the city had their own social clubs, church halls, things like that. Not all the churches allowed their halls to be used. Some of the churches didn't support the strike, but the immigrant societies were really very much involved in the dispensing of food aid. Other unions all over the country. We have logbooks of the funds that were sent that are in the Lawrence History Center. You know, small printers locals or textile locals or whatever would send $5, $10. Envelope showed up that just said to the Lawrence strike with like money, you know, like quarters and dimes in the envelopes, and so money just sort of arrived, and it was somewhat spontaneous. And as well, I mean, I put a photo up today on the Facebook site of a mass rally in Portland, Oregon. I mean, you couldn't be any further from Lawrence, Mass. and still be in the United States at that time than in Portland, Oregon. It was the 5th giant rally that was held in solidarity with the Lawrence strike in Portland, Oregon. That's what the photo is that I found a while back. So this thing happened all the time, and at these rallies, money would be collected. A really interesting thing, when the militia came to Lawrence, this is really interesting. Harvard University, president of Harvard University was a mill owner himself. Harvard students were in their exam period during the strike. He sent a letter to the students that in essence said, I'll make sure you get a passing grade for your final exams, whether you take them or not, if you're interested in going to Lawrence and being part of the militia to put down the strike. So lots of Harvard students come to Lawrence as part of the militia. But what also happens is that all the women's colleges, Radcliffe, Wellesley, Smith, Mount Holyoke, the students there, women, raise money for the strike, come to Lawrence, work in the soup kitchen. Several faculty from those colleges come and give speeches about the strike, travel around giving speeches to raise money for the strike. And so it's really interesting to kind of look at Harvard versus the women's colleges during the strike too. But so the aid is really collected, dispensed very carefully. Over 25,000 people get fed during the strike. As I said before, doctors volunteer, nurses volunteer to make sure everybody's healthy. I mean, a really cool act of solidarity. Lawrence is crisscrossed with railroads, trains. Coal is the main source of heat. When train engines pull through the city of Lawrence, the guys that would shovel the coal into the train shovel buckets of coal off the train onto the siding, and then the kids go down with buckets and get all the coal and bring it back to their flats so that they'll have heat, which, you know, is a really interesting, another one of these really cool things that happens. I found the other day reading more about the strike that Lowell, which is the next city over, mill workers in Lowell donate a cow to the Lawrence strikers, and the cow is slaughtered for meat, and they actually walked a cow from Lowell to Lawrence, and there's like this very big celebration as the cow is sacrificed for the good of the strike and the strikers. I don't know how that goes with any of your non-meat eaters in your audience, but it's again another sort of really interesting cultural sort of act of solidarity.
And not only solidarity, but spirit of generosity of the people,
Yep.
supporting each other, and outside people supporting the cause that they were witnessing.
Yeah, because most of the people that are donating don't have any money themselves. It's not like they've got a bank account that they're drawing on. It's they're They're really sacrificing, most people, to send money to Lawrence. They're sacrificing.
And do you think that was because everybody recognized the importance of it, that those strikers spoke for many more people than just the strikers?
Yeah, this was much bigger than just Lawrence. So early on in the Lawrence strike, what also happened was most of the other mill cities in New England gave their workers raises, small raises, because they were hoping, holy crap, something like this doesn't happen in our town. So in Nashua, New Hampshire, and Fall River, and New Bedford, and Holyoke, and Lowell, and all the other big mill communities in New England, small raises, 3%, 5%, were given in hopes that something like this wouldn't happen in Lawrence. And so the workers in these other communities really knew that workers in Lawrence were really doing something here that was going to benefit not just the workers in Lawrence in the long run. And so, yeah, people were really looking, the idea, again, of really entrenched capital, of these really big mill owners. Again, the role of women in the strike, we should come back to and talk about some of the really amazing stuff women did. But the role of women in the strike, just the acts of solidarity, the networks that were created, this was real theater. This was Occupy Lawrence, literally. And so just like Occupy New York, a while ago just had all eyes on it or whatever, this had all eyes on it. Newspapers from around the world showed up in Lawrence to cover this because, like, Italian newspapers were interested in what was happening to Italian workers, Irish newspapers, the Irish workers, Greek newspapers, the Greek workers. And so there was like, this was covered everywhere. This was, this was Twitter before Twitter. I mean, this was an amazing network of the media of the day covering this, in every which way they could.
And there's a great object lesson there for us, I think. I'm always really big on leveraging our media effectively because mainstream media has let us down. So using all the tools at our disposal, whether it be flyers or newspapers back in the day, or Twitters and emails now, that's how we communicate and build networks. I do want to get into all the women's role in this, as far as I can tell, was huge. And it was actually, in reading, it felt like a very powerful emergence of the women's movement at the time. So I was wondering, proportionally of the striking demographic, do we have a feel for how many of them were women? What were some of their stories, and what were the roles that they played before, during, and after the strike?
The shorthand answer is more women than men worked in the mills, and huge numbers of women were involved in the strike. From the arrest records that we have, more women were arrested than men during the strike. Women were far more clever and creative in ways that they harassed the militia, amongst other things. And so, I mean, really, I think the backstory here is, and this is really brilliantly told in a book by historian Artis Cameron, who wrote a book called Radicals of the Worst Sort, a really good book about the strike, and she really looked at the role of women.
Can you repeat that title again?
Yeah. Radicals of the Worst Sort.
Okay, thank you.
And that was umbrage taken by the mill owners, and they were disgusted with women striking the way they were, and they just sort of called them these were radicals of the worst sort. But anyway, the women were meeting together not as strikers, but meeting together as women, trying to figure out how to get through the day, how to feed their families, how to raise their kids in the desperate straits that they were in 1908, 1909, 1910, 1911. They knew each other. They had each other's backs well in advance of the strike taking place, all happening out of sight in a way. And again, something the mill owners didn't think was possible, that these women talked to each other across different nationalities and that they would stand for each other at a moment of confrontation like the strike. And so that's really what happened, that women are living together in tenements. In Cameron's book, in Radicals of the Worst Sort, she looks at a lot of the arrest records, and she makes these really great maps in the book to show that a lot of women who are arrested on the same day all live in the same apartment building. You know, like a eight apartment unit. They all go out together to get arrested, and do some really outrageous things to the militia. At one point, they accost a militiaman. A mob of women. They cut his suspenders, take his pants off, and dangle him over a bridge, like they're going to drop him into the canal. They don't, but they scare the bejeebers out of the militia guy. At other points, when militia horses are riding down on women in the streets, trying to intimidate them, women wore really big floppy hats back then with big hat pins, probably like 6-8 inches long, whatever, like that. And some of them would sneak around behind the horses and stick the horses in the butt. With a hat pin, the horse would rear up, toss the militia guy off into the snow, and then a bunch of women would jump on the guy and beat him up. So they did a lot of that. I mean, women. The thing about the strike is that it's not. Again, it's usually written about as well. They cut people's pay by 2 hours, by 32 cents, and that's what the strike was about. That's not what the strike was about. The wage cut was the spark, but what the strike was really about was Lawrence had one of the highest infant mortality rates in the United States, one of the highest mortality rates for kids under the age of 5, and the death statistics for mill workers were like battlefield casualty statistics. The strike was really about life. The strike was really about survival. Again, the 32 cents mattered, of course, but you would not have had 25 to 30,000 people out in the street for 11 weeks over 32 cents. Mm-hmm. People were full up with abuse. Were full up with every single person in the city knew a woman who had a baby die. For sure, every single person in the city knew somebody who had a relative who was maimed or lost their life in a mill accident. Every single person in the city knew somebody in the city who had tuberculosis or some other lung ailment from working in the mills for too long. That's what the strike was really about.
And you know, I'm glad you made that point, because so often the strikes are characterized or framed around wages and benefits. You know, historical and current, like the Chicago Teachers Union strike was predicated on wages and benefits, but the real issue there was privatization of the schools. That they were using the leverage of how they could strike in order to get that message out. So it's, again, history, right? It's like they were doing the same thing in Lawrence. Or do you have any like first-person stories of the strike you'd like to share, one or two, like point of view things, or is that
from back then?
Yeah.
There's stuff I've read in the newspapers, like when the strike was over, the newspapers covered this final meeting on the Lawrence Common, and they interviewed workers and asked them what the strike meant to them, and whatever. And one worker said very simply put, nothing will ever be the same, which I thought was just really a great way. You know, if I was going to write a book about the strike, I think I would use that as part of my title. Mm-hmm. And then he went on to talk about how workers had never thought that they could sort of do this, that they could stand up for themselves in such a way, and that this unity could be created in such a powerful way. So, there weren't a lot of where you find that stuff is in the newspapers and some of the journalistic pieces of a variety of writers that came to Lawrence during the period. So, I mean, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, a major figure in the industrial workers of the world, in her autobiography, which is titled Rebel Girl, she has a long chapter on Lawrence and what she saw in Lawrence, which is actually really a great thing for people to read if they're interested in a first-person account. So Elizabeth Flynn, who's a figure that everybody should know. If I was around back then, I would have wanted to marry her, but I'm not sure she would have had. I'm not sure she would have had me. But she was a really important figure in Lawrence during the strike. She was just a major. In the magazine articles that are written about her, she's like a rock star. She stayed at a hotel in downtown Lawrence, and people would be outside of her, outside of the rooming house where she stayed in the morning, so they could walk up the street with her. She was that charismatic a figure. She was very young at the time, but she was an incredible speaker and just a very passionate defender of workers. And had grown up nearby in Nashua and then lived in New York City for a long time. She actually was kicked out of high school for an oratorical contest giving a speech about why socialism was better for workers than capitalism. And they kicked her out of high school, and she became an IWW organizer for the rest of her life. So that sort of kicking her out of school backfired.
Yeah.
Because she became a much more significant figure maybe than she might have been otherwise. Because she's just a. But yeah, Rebel Girl. That's a good read too for sort of an account on the ground of somebody involved in the strike.
Okay, thank you for that. We're keeping up with all these books and suggestions, and we put them on the pad for people to access after the show. So, you know, anything you can think to toss out for us, we would love to hear it. So, what was the non-striking part of the Lawrence community after all this transpired? What was their response? Because the community consisted so much of the people who were striking, but the peripheral people, how was the community reaction to that?
During the strike, a lot of merchants extended small amounts of credit to workers so that they could get food, like corner grocery stores, that sort of thing. Several of the churches were supportive of the strike, but the largest Catholic church, the Irish Catholic Church, was not. And when the strike ended, there was an effort to try to paint the strike as the work of a bunch of outside agitators. Mm-hmm. And so the larger business community, bankers, mill owners, sort of the big guys.
The one-percenters of the day.
The one-percenters of the day, good way to put it. Essentially, through the late summer and the fall, began a campaign to try to rewrite the narrative and say that immigrants had been manipulated and duped by a bunch of outside agitators. So on Columbus Day in 1912, there was a gigantic God and Country parade in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and it was the beginning of sort of driving the story of the strike underground. And for a long time, people didn't talk about the strike. On the 50th anniversary of the strike in 1962, they celebrated this God and Country parade, not the strike. The strike's history was very much disappeared from the Lawrence story for a really long time. So it's been significant over the last couple of years to be going around talking to people about the strike, and many of them said, you know, my grandfather or my grandmother was in the strike, but they would never talk about it, or they only talked about it when they were on their deathbed and told me they were arrested during the strike or something like that. It was something that lots of people, they might talk about it amongst their family, but sometimes they wouldn't even do that. In the exhibit I was sitting one day, a woman came who was 90, whose mother had been arrested. She knew that during the strike, and she wanted to know if I knew what she was arrested for, which was a really great story.
And so, did you? Were you able to find it? Oh, okay.
No, I mean, now like a bunch of students from Boston College are actually entering all the arrest records into a database. And so maybe in a year or two that might be searchable, but no way to do it now. They're just a whole bunch of pieces of paper with names and dates and descriptions of what people did. So to go through hundreds and hundreds of pieces of paper,
Right, right.
Couldn't necessarily happen. So I mean, it's really only like in the 1970s that the strike story begins to reemerge in Lawrence and begins to be discussed again. And then there's a Heritage Festival every year, starting in the late 70s, early 80s. And it's mainly like the Village Voice is one of the first newspapers in New York City that actually comes to Lawrence to sort of rewrite the story of the strike and to interview people and to talk to people with historic memory of the strike. And that begins sort of a resurrection. And then, going back to Judy Collins, where we started, then people sort of resurrect the poem, put it to music, and that's what really begins the sort of reinvestigation of the history of the strike. But for over 50 years, it's sort of, we don't talk about that. That was godless IWW. That was because of them. That really had nothing to do with us. The business owners and bankers and churches and whatnot thought that if the city was thought of as a place where the strike happened, the city would die. No businesses would come. No investments would be made. Mm-hmm. This was part of their rationale for disappearing the strike. And actually, in that weekend in October in 1912, they really sort of publicly try to shame the IWW and members of the IWW in Lawrence. And a Lithuanian worker, still an IWW member, has his IWW pin on his jacket. He's beaten over the head with a rock on the streets of Lawrence and is killed. And so when we talk about the strike, we talk about him as the third worker killed in the 1912 strike. That, as far as we're concerned, he's murdered, basically. Nobody ever gets arrested for what happens, and he's found on the street with his head caved in. Jonas Smolskis is his name.
It's an interesting lesson of what happens when we lose control of our narratives, and how the powers that be can so rapidly respond, create a fictional history, and the truth is buried only to be resurrected 50 or 60 years ago. There's an object lesson there too. It's why we have to rise up and speak out constantly. Can you provide a little bit of contrast between the Great Lawrence Strike and current day labor actions, and what comes to mind is the CTU strike, and also the Sensata strike, Bainport Sensata strike, and how those two are connected across history, if at all?
Well, I think the teacher strike, which I know more about, but those sort of big mass strikes, things that are also happening, around the world as well. Strikes only can succeed now, I think, in the sort of climate that we're in, when they're broadly based and when the initiative is really to make them be community strikes, not just the strikes of a single workplace, of a single building, of a single narrow grouping of workers in a particular workplace. We have to think about the success of the Lawrence strike really came from the fact that it was community that had the backs of the strikers, and it was the community that supported the strikers financially, morally, in so many ways. Otherwise, that strike wouldn't have been successful. And that, for me, the lessons of, I teach labor history, and I was also in, a labor union, a business agent of a union for a long time as well. And I think that what happened over the decades away sort of from that era and from the sit-down strikes in the 1930s as well, is the labor movement got narrower and narrower and narrower and more exclusive and bargained in very narrow ways over wages, hours, and conditions of employment, which is what the labor law said, only inside the four walls of the place where they worked. And the community was never sort of called upon to understand the relationship between a healthy workplace and a healthy community, and a workplace where there were lots of people working meant that there would be wages to spend, there would be money that people would have to support other businesses, other cultural, social activities, to support the Little League and this and that, other thing, the sort of civic engagement. And so we really, I think for to a great degree, sadly, lost that. And labor law reform in the 40s and the 50s, Taft, things that we do have to do another hour. But a lot of it sort of reframed what was okay for workers to do in the name of trying to defend their jobs. And businesses, capital owners, whatever you want to call them, were much more footloose and fancy-free. Workers bargained and won many things, but they really were contingent on actually having a job in a specific workplace. Mm-hmm. And employers never thought that way. They were always thinking in a much larger way. And so workers won what I would call place-based and job-based rights and benefits and privileges, and those didn't mean anything, shortly after World War II, as capital became more and more mobile. And so we do have to go back to really, this much, I think, more like social movement unionism, much more.
We're back on live again. Sorry for that. We just had to bump the old XSplit. So sorry about that, Bob. We had brief interruption. Can we rewind just a smidge and talk about, I think when we froze, you were talking, and this is probably due to the alphabet agencies. I want to say hi to you guys. Thank you for watching. We are not your enemies. We're all in this together. But let's back up a little bit, and you were making the point about the election tomorrow and that the fact that the words work and class have not been used in the political debate this year.
Yeah, I probably won't be so eloquent this time.
It was really good.
I'm going to say that was probably the most brilliant thing I ever said in my life, and now it's gone. But no, I said I'm just so terribly frustrated by the whole election process and the fact that everybody somehow magically has become middle class, and that I think that the labor movement has to, no matter what happens tomorrow, the organized labor has paid its debt to the Democratic Party a million times over, and now it needs to, and me being part of that, I'm in a union where I teach, need to craft our own identity and need to rethink what it is that a labor movement ought to be doing. I think we've sort of lost our way, and we've let the fact that jobs have left be sort of an excuse for hanging our heads and saying, oh, what can we do? We've lost all these jobs. There's lots of other jobs to organize. There's lots of other things that can be done. But the labor movement in general just can't be taken for granted. And so long as we do that, we're going to get these campaigns where $1 billion is spent. And as far as I'm concerned, not one thing was discussed that had anything really to do with the plight of most working people in America. I think that was completely missed from beginning to end.
That's a good point, and I think we have to bear some of the responsibility about that. And you said the labor movement can't be taken for granted. I also would say we cannot take ourselves for granted. We can't sit around and wring our hands and pull our hair and say, "Oh, woe is us." We do have to take the example of the Lawrence strike and all the other successful actions that were broad-based social actions where people depended on each other and supported each other, and we have to not take ourselves for granted. We have to recognize that all working people combined are a huge force with great social and political power.
And I think that's right, and I think we have to learn from the history that, the course of strikes over the 19th century, 20th century, whatever, you don't always win. We're trying to push a rock up a hill against profound forces that don't want the rock rolling up the hill. And so, you have to sort of learn from history. You have to build momentum. Things don't always happen the way they're supposed to happen, but if we're not going to push, then change isn't going to happen, because the people that don't want that change to happen will be perfectly happy leaving it like it is.
Right. We cannot get stuck by inertia and apathy. It's just,
Yeah.
and we're going to roll a rock. We're going to get our fingers and toes mashed, but we got to do it because it needs to be
That's
done.
the way it goes. That's the way it goes.
I want to give you an opportunity here as we kind of wrap up to speak about the centennial. For the viewers and chatters, if you didn't know, Bob is the chair of the Bread and Roses Centennial that's had a year-long celebration of the Great Lawrence Strike of 1912. Has done beautiful work, and there's a huge organization behind that. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that and where people can see the material and what's on stack as the year winds up for you.
This has been a really broad-based community effort starting over 2 years ago. A number of community organizations in Lawrence, several local unions, the university. We've been able to raise money to build actually build a history exhibit on the history of the strike. We've had, at this point, I think 40 different events over the year, from concerts and an academic symposium to actually a fashion show on what the well-dressed mill worker wore to work in 1912, with costumes designed by high school students, amongst others, art exhibits, films, just a whole array of things. We're sort of winding down. For anybody that might be watching that's in the greater Boston area, on November 23rd, we are going to have a play on the life of one of the strike leaders, a gentleman named Arturo Giovannitti. One of the people who I mentioned earlier was arrested and ended up in jail for 10 months. The region Milanese that he comes from in Italy has put together a play based on his life, and it's going to be it's really great. It's going to be at Yale in the theater program at Yale. Then it's going to be at City College in New York. The only showing outside of that area is going to be in Lawrence, in the Everett Mill building, the first building where the strike started, exactly 100 years to the day from when Giovannitti gave his incredible speech to the jury. Each of the 3 men who were arrested could speak to the jury before the jury retired to deliberate, and so it's really uncanny. They contacted us several months ago and said they were doing this play and would we like it to come to Boston, and so we thought they wanted to be in Boston, and then several weeks ago they said no, we'd rather have it in Lawrence. So it's amazing, exactly 100 years to the day. This play will be happening in the Everett Mill building. If anybody in the listening audience wants to find out more and wants to buy tickets, they can, if they Google the Lawrence History Center, there's info there on how to reserve a ticket and find out more about the play. There's a virtual exhibit that we've constructed, that my students constructed, exhibit.breadandrosescentennial.org. I'm sure you'll just post that somewhere, which is a history of the strike. We also have a very active Facebook page, which is a lot about the strike, but has now been branching out to do labor history more generally. I'm going to run out of things to do at the end of December, so I decided I would start putting more labor history on there, not just history about the strike, to try to keep it going. And probably there won't be as many postings, but at least it'll be something to keep pushing the story out there. But this has been just a brilliant social effort. We've finished the year. We still have money in the bank from the money that we raised, and we don't owe anybody anything. What community group can ever say that?
That's great.
So lots of union support. We had a huge parade on Labor Day in Lawrence. Bread and Roses, a parade for social and economic justice through the streets of Lawrence, exactly where the strikers had marched 100 years ago. Lots of unions came out. There was over 2,000 people. It was just really this very exciting thing. So it's all in all, it's been just an unbelievable year. The other cool thing on the Facebook page, if anybody finds it, and this was just this really, like, I don't know, like a weird sort of happenstance, but it's a good way to I think it's a good way to end what we're doing tonight. When we opened the exhibit on January 12th, of 2012, a gentleman came to the exhibit opening who was 104 years old. He had been 4 years old in Lawrence at the time of the strike. He was one of the kids that went with his father to Barre, Vermont, one of the kids that was sent out in the children's exodus. And he came to, he was 104 at the time, and he came to the exhibit opening. We did a fundraising calendar, the Lawrence Library did a fundraising calendar to raise money for stuff during the centennial. And one of the very famous pictures from the children's exodus is a photo of all the kids on the steps of the library in Barre, Vermont. And he's in this picture. We use that picture in the calendar. And so we have this we just posted on the Facebook site a picture of him at 104 years old looking at the picture of himself in the calendar. How cool is that? Anyway, he's 105 tomorrow. And so we have a picture of him with his birthday cake on our Facebook page now. It's just like you couldn't make it up. It's just such a great sort of piece of the story. And so people that frequent the Facebook site are wishing him happy birthday. He's got about 75 different happy birthdays last time I checked, or before we went on air, from people from all over the world who have been following the site. So it's just exciting. He's such a great guy, and still very with it, and just all caught up and excited about the centennial and people remembering the strike. So it was a great day for us when he showed up. He got us obviously a standing ovation back January 12th when we introduced him, and people went crazy.
That's an outstanding story, and I think it summarizes the work you've done around this so nicely. What a life that man has lived, the things he's seen, the span of history he has experienced. I want to thank you so much for sharing your evening with us. It's been absolutely delightful. We have all the links and all the information you've shared with us posted on the pad. We really appreciate your time and energy, and your passion for the subject and the work shines through, and it's very inspiring. It's been a real educational experience and everything I'd hoped for. So thank you for making time in your schedule to speak with us.
It's been an absolute pleasure. You can tell, I'm sure, that there's no place I'd rather be than in Lawrence at this point and talking about this stuff. So it's been a wonderful year. I'm actually gonna miss it when it's over. Although obviously I'll still tell the story, but there's just something about being able to do it now. So I've had a great time. Thank you for inviting me. Everybody that works with you for making this all simple. I'm always leery of technology, but it seems to have all worked well, and hopefully I don't sound too stupid.
No, you're great. You're great.
And anyway,
thank you, and I hope you have a good rest of the week, and thank you for the good works you've been doing. We really appreciate it, and best of luck to you.
My pleasure. Keep at it. Thank you.
As we go marching, marching in the beauty of the day, a million darkened kitchens, a thousand mill lofts gray, are touched with all the radiance that a sudden sun discloses. For the people hear us singing, bread and roses, bread and roses. As we go marching, marching, we battle too for men, for they are women's children, and we honor them again. Our lives shall not be sweated from birth until life closes. Hearts starve as well as bodies. Give us bread, but give us roses. as we go marching on.